I'd like to now move to the next fireside chat, Mardangi or Jazbaat, Conversations on Men and Mental Health. I'd like to call upon our next speaker, Dr. Amit Sen. Dr. Amit Sen is a child and adolescent psychiatrist with more than 30 years of experience in the field. He is a co-founder and director at Children First, with his main areas of interest include service development, community outreach, awareness building, and advocacy. After having worked and trained in various government and non-government organizations, both in India and the UK, he has conceptualized and created models of child mental health care that are dynamic and culture-specific. For example, he is the founder of the ever-evolving mental health program in Salam Balak Trust, an organization looking after thousands of street children. A TEDx speaker and master trainer, Dr. Sen has been invited as faculty by various teaching institutions of repute, including Ashoka University, Delhi University, TIS Mumbai, University of Rwanda, and UN organizations. He has worked with national and international organizations like the UN Human Rights Commission, UNICEF, in the area of trauma, child sexual abuse, and juvenile justice. He has also presented in various international and national conferences, written in various publications and newspapers, and spoken in various media across the field, along with having written and published many chapters in books and scientific papers. Thank you, Dr. Sen, for being here. We're very, very happy to have you join us. And in conversation with Dr. Sen, I'd like to call Lora K. Prabhu, co-founder and managing director at CEQUIN. Please give them a round of applause, folks.
Dr. Sen, I have been the greatest fan following your work. The kind of work that you do at a personal and professional level, I have learned so much. So it's my real privilege to have this conversation and allow the audience in the room as well as those who will be watching this later on YouTube to learn a little bit from you. Just to kind of set the ball rolling, because the context of work that CEQUIN does, gender being at the center of it. So I just want to pose that to you. How important is it for us to understand the role of gender in shaping human personalities? This whole debate, nature versus nurture. How important is this as a point of study and practice in the field of psychiatry and psychology?
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for having me in this space. It's already has been so stimulating right from the morning, and I think the initial talks and Rahul Bose's passionate ideas and sometimes perhaps a bit provocative, but all the same, it's I think raised many questions that we perhaps could begin to ask and address. So I'm sure that all of you understand that the intersection between gender and mental health is deep, nuanced, and increasingly coming up in our discourse, even when we work with young people and in the community as they grow up. Gender, of course, is a central part of who they are, as their identity depends on that, and it's a good thing that in certain spaces there is a degree of freedom and choice that young people can now make about where they belong and how to define it, sometimes in their own terms. So some of the gender stereotypes that we used to know is probably dissolving, although in the fringes. However, if you look at the larger perspective and the larger community, I think that rigid gender stereotypes still remain, and that often restricts the choices that young women and men can make. And I hope we are able to have a discussion on how that impacts growth and development and mental health, because it does in very profound ways, and we have seen that over the years, experienced it. And I might be able to share with you some stories that I've brought without taking names and maybe tweaking those stories a little bit to help understand how this manifests. It goes without saying that some of these the stereotypes about gender, they start very early in life, right from the time a child is born and the kind of clothes they are made to wear, or the kind of privileges, particularly the boys or the men begin to get very, very early indeed. and how that shapes their worldview. So there is a bit that comes from looking at the immediate family, the parents, modeling them. But increasingly, as they go out to schools, into the community. There are many other influences that begin to come in. And of course, nowadays, besides school, besides extended family, besides what they read, the music they listen to, the movies they watch, there is also social media, which has had a deep, deep impact on how young people see themselves in terms of their identity, their forming personalities, if you like. And what role does gender play in it is very important to look at, because it can make or break somebody's identity and their mental well-being as they grow and walk into the wide world, so to say. Yeah.
Just being a medical practitioner, doctor, a man of science, and we, as sociologists, we kind of trying to understand the structure of gender. So really, when you hear, men are born to be this way, girls are born to be this way. So I just want you to kind of give us a little bit more about that when you talk about how, biology comes into this space, because how do you, because this whole conversation that you're going to be taking forward in terms of how men see themselves, I just wanted to understand and actually emphasize how it can be totally socially created, distance from science.
So if I can also talk a little bit about the lens that we take when we look at mental health and well-being, right? So we talk about a biopsychosocial model, and I think one of the big tussles that's happening in the mental health space is about focusing more on the psychosocial bit, as opposed to the biomedical model, which is again very restrictive. It can actually be reductionist, right? And similarly, when we look at gender and we look at what emerges from there in terms of behaviors and attitudes and relationships, there also there's a dichotomy and an overlap. There is some bit of biology that plays into this, no doubt. I mean, if you look at little boys and girls playing in the field, the girls will probably gravitate towards things that they do together. They might look at the flowers or run after butterflies. Again, I'm being stereotypical. That's not always the case, but if you look at a bunch of kids who are, let's say, gone to a birthday party, right, and you can see that the boys are probably getting together, jumping on the sofa and pulling each other down, and they don't care so much about if their shirt's coming off and stuff like that. Whereas the girls are probably much more careful with what they're doing, etc., right? Perhaps part of that is biologically driven, and we know that, genetics and some of the hormones which particularly kick in after adolescence, they can influence behavior, no doubt. But in our view, in the way we have seen it, it is much more socially constructed than we are willing to admit. And that again is, simple things like, I remember that as a young boy, as I was growing up, and I was the eldest in the family, I had another brother and a sister, and if my mother was serving us food, the big mutton piece would come to me. And it took me a little while to understand what the significance of that was. And it took me another couple of years to say, if you do that, I'm going to get up and go. I'm not going to eat my meal, right? So again, of course, there was another part of me which was becoming aware that this is not right. What's happening in the family is not right. And these are things that begin to happen very, very early. The messages that we get in terms of privilege, in terms of what you can do. Again, I struggled with my academics. I had huge difficulties with my attention and focus in class and otherwise. And as the eldest boy, I was expected to do well in academics and move on, and I eventually got into medical school, I don't know how, but it was a big struggle. And for that, the flack I got, right? So because I did not again fit in to this stereotype of being the eldest boy and, from a middle class Bengali family who are into academics and, high achievement, I could not live up to that. So my sense of self got a huge beating over those years because, the admonishment, even physical beatings that I would get for not being able to live up to those expectations was extreme, right? And so, again, these are things that happen in every space. It happens in schools, it happens in, in parks, and, for instance, when you begin to grow up and you start sharing, locker rooms with other boys, and you begin to hear the banter and the way they talk about girls, you know. And in the beginning, I was shocked to hear what the kind of things that were being said. So the objectification of it just comes into this space like that. Now, where have these kids heard it? I'm sure they've heard it in their own families, from probably older brothers, or even perhaps their fathers and uncles. We don't know, but it's come into the space, and the influence has begun out there, right? Now, of course, you have the choice whether to join that or to exclude yourself. But as vulnerable young boys who want to belong, who are struggling to form their identity, it's very hard to say, I don't want to be a part of this conversation, right? You really struggle with that. And that's why, and these are many such instances, and when we talk about such, you know, the gender oppression that we see, not just in girls, which is obvious, which we have been talking about for decades, that we also see in boys. And from my own experiences, I can talk about how that is important. And I think it is, you know, it becomes, as you know, some of you have said, a win-win situation if we are able to address it from both sides. So you know, your approach to look at the boys' side of things, therefore, assumes so much importance. We have known about many things that do not work in our society, and we have tried to kind of, let's say, child abuse, right? Or domestic violence. And we've taken a very punitive approach to it. There are laws laid down, you know. The POCSO is a very harsh law, and the moment you get to know about child abuse, the perpetrator, without any questions, is put behind bars. And sometimes it might take years to, even if they are innocent, to prove it, right? Now, I'm not saying that I'm not against POCSO. It had to come. It was very important for it to come when it did in 2012. But it is a punitive method of looking at something which is deeply embedded in our community, right? Has child sexual abuse reduced due to POCSO? Then the answer is a flat no, it hasn't. It hasn't at all, because we haven't actually gone down to the grassroots of what actually causes it, ultimately, right? So the determinants of what causes child sexual abuse or gender discrimination or gender violence are out there in society to see. You know, sometimes very subtle and sometimes very stark. The stark ones, I think, all of us have learned to identify and call out. But there are many other things that keep happening, you know, very subtly, that then give rise to this eventual behavior, which is to do with misogyny, which is to do with domestic violence, which is to do with, you know, the kind of things that Rahul was talking about, that, you know, you go to an extreme to prove your power and worth and place in this world by battering the other person down, just to feel important, just to feel powerful, just to feel that, you know, I have a say in this matter. Because increasingly, those stereotypes are getting challenged. And of course, that's one extreme, but in many other ways, you know, that it plays out in more subtle ways. Like, you know, subtle transgressions that happen, you know, which are just brushed aside. Oh, never mind, he's just a boisterous boy. You know, he doesn't know, you know, how this is impacting you. Or, you know, you talk to girls, of course, I mean, you know, just keep clear of them. Or, so you're actually talking to the wrong person here, because the transgression is happening from the boy who is getting away with it even without realizing the impact of it. And these things build on one on top of the other and gradually then snowball out of control. And that's when you then have the molestation, the rape, or the domestic violence that takes place, isn't it? And it's vital to look at the determinants and how this develops over a period of time. So we, you know, in our organization and the, you know, our cohort of people who work in mental health have also increasingly, over the last decade at least, have tried to look at even mental health, not just as a final outcome or, you know, when the crisis happens. Mental health is not about diagnosis and treatment and clinics, etc. Mental health resides everywhere. Mental health resides in a public bus when, you know, a woman feels cornered and afraid. It happens when, you know, a boy who's probably, you know, inclined towards art and music is called a sissy and a wimp, and bullied and called names. It resides there. It resides in the alcoholic father who comes and, you know, after work and will get down to his drink and then say things and do things where people cower in the family, and nobody has the guts to actually stand up and say anything. Mental health resides there because the impact of all that then eventually culminates into a depression, anxiety, an eating disorder, a schizophrenia. All that happens as a consequence of many of these things that are happening. And we never ever look at those determinants, what we call the developmental model, to be able to call it out earlier. To say that, we have to preempt it. For instance, in physical health of a kid, you begin to worry about, not worry, but concerned or caring about a child's physical health from the word go. From the time a mother becomes pregnant, she will be given the best nutrition, will have her vaccinations. The moment the child is born, there is a pediatrician to make sure that he breathes on time. There is great nutrition and other things that make sure that he doesn't fall ill. And if he was to fall ill at any time, they rush to a pediatrician immediately, isn't it? Yeah. And as they grow up, they go to school. There are many things that are taught to them about how to look after yourself, how not to get hurt. What are the kind of things that you need to eat to grow up and be strong and healthy and so on. So the emphasis on physical health starts from the word go, and we are trying to do many things to prevent it from, again, spiral out of control and become a diabetes in childhood, or become, somebody who has malnutrition. So we're looking at that, right? What do we do about mental health when it comes to developmental things that happen from the time a child is born? I don't think we really care about, let's say, the attachment, right? Or the different wiring or profile, addressing neurodiversity at a very young age. What happens to a child when they go through transitions in school and are trying to make friends and perhaps getting rejected, right? What happens when they go from primary to middle school and the transitions that happen there and the stress of it? Or step into adolescence. I mean, their world is in chaos and turmoil. Is there anything to address it? Is there anything to help them become more conversant or aware of what's going on within them, to give them names and able to identify some of what they're going on within them, themselves? Are they, for instance, emotionally attuned to themselves and other people, right? Are they aware of some of these things? And these are the questions that we often ask. And similarly, and in that context, gender plays a huge role. And the kind of things that we have been discussing from the time we had the workshop with the young men who were there to now, gender plays a central role in the making of these young people into wholesome, comfortable with their bodies and gender and identity kind of people. Or we could have people who have huge amounts of complexities and self-doubts, etc., as to where they belong, where they'll fit in, and they carry that with themselves, right? And when stressful situations come, it then erupts as a mental health problem. And that's when you begin to, and when you unearth that, when you begin to deconstruct it, you realize that there are many things that are happening with their gender, with their sexuality, with the things that are relational, that are now beginning to play out, which never got addressed in the past. It never was actually talked about when the time was ripe, when they could have actually. There are some schools, very few selected schools and families perhaps. And again, when you talk about mental health, schools will say, oh yeah, we have workshops, So once in a year, you have a psychologist or a mental health professional coming in to talk to students. And again, I'm going back to what Rahul was saying, that, if you have to actually become better at something, then you have to do it every day, especially something as complex as, let's say, emotional awareness and intelligence. If you have to get better at it, you have to do it every day, like you do maths, like you go out and play to develop your motor and fine motor skills. You have to do it every day to be able to develop that awareness, the skills, and the confidence to be able to engage with that within yourself and in the world outside.
Dr. Sen, I want you to dwell a little bit about the father-son relationship, the role of the father, especially in the South Asian context, how fathers are kind of supposed to be not very communicative, and what does that, look like when it impacts those relationships? Because after the boy, the first port of call for shaping his own masculinity is looking at his father.
Yeah, I think fathers begin to become important when children have had a few years of their lives. In the beginning, it is most often the mother who they have the primary attachment with. I mean, if we look at very kind of, again, step back and, take the lens of what we have learned about attachment behaviors, etc. over the years. This is how it looks like mostly. And then you have other extended family members they get attached to. Father begins to play a very important role from the time, I think, children begin to go out of home, they want to play, they want to go to the outdoors. And of course, during adolescent years, and those are crucial years where the relationship, communication, the attachment and bond, role modeling, etc., has a huge role, right? And it's absolutely true that it's absolutely true that Indian men, even the ones who believe that they're very involved fathers, are fun fathers. You know, they will come back and play with the child. They will take them out for a holiday, yeah? Have a bit of a, rough and tumble and joking around with them. But when it comes to the real issues of, let's say, what did the teacher say about your maths? Or, what happens when you have come back with scraped, bleeding knees from the park, right? Or what happens when your child is not eating their tiffin in school? That the mother has to handle. So all of the hard things, the mother, and again, these are gender stereotypes as well. So the father is a fun father, and he might say, yes, I do. I think about it. I come back. I have fun with my child. And oftentimes, therefore, the father is the favorite person, but the mother is getting the flack for doing the dirty job, isn't it? Yeah, and that is an awareness that I don't think even the more aware or educated have. That what they're doing is still in boxes. It's still. Also, it's in a way decided by the man, by the father, as to what his role will be, There's very little say, and this is our experience working with families, that the mother has in that. I mean, there are mothers who will scream and who will protest and say that you have to do this, and you also have to come back on time when there is a parent-teacher meeting. Sometimes the father will oblige, but most of the time, it's a losing battle they're fighting. And as children begin to get into adolescence, they fear their fathers, yeah? They might have easier conversations on the surface, but they're never able to talk about the deeper issues. So if they have self-doubt, if they have, let's say, any doubts about their gender or sexuality, they will not go to the father, they will go to the mother, if they can, right? And that also, of course, depends on their relationship with the mother, the degree of comfort they have, and how emotionally safe they feel, and so on, right? So I think the world is changing. I mean, there are, of course, when you go to other spaces, perhaps in rural India, the father's and the mother's role are much more defined. In some instances, it perhaps makes it easier to get, go on with family life because your roles are so well defined, you know what to do, what to expect, etc. In the urban areas, there is a lot coming at us, from social media, from books and literature and, and so on, and questions that are asked in forums like this, which reach that population. And some fathers are perhaps, sitting up to take notice and introspect as to what their role could be, right? Just to share that when my kids were young, my wife would say, okay, I've fed them, I've done everything, now it's time for them to sleep, but if they have to change their nappy or if they wake up, it's your job to get up in the night, right? And whether work or not the next day, I just had to do it. I had to and I loved it after a while. I just enjoyed it. Now, those are kind of shifts that happens where there is awareness, there is some negotiation, and there is a willingness to be able to look within and say, what am I doing as a parent? What is my responsibility after all? What are the circumstances look like, When this happened for the first time, we had both our kids when we were residing in UK and there was no home help. So we had to do everything on our own. So, we had to be very careful about dividing responsibility and all that. So perhaps that's why it came easily. But even over here, the realities of each family in the communities is different, one from the other. Nuclear families who have come away from smaller towns and have set up home here may have a different set of realities. And it's important then for fathers and mothers to sit down and reflect on what their roles will be And to be able to be there for your child, and especially a male child, a boy that you have, how do you want to, sort of show up? How do you want to present yourself? What kind of time would you like to spend with them? What kind of topics would you want to discuss? Even if they challenge you with questions, are you ready to take that, that challenging question, the discomfort, and say, okay, So for instance, my kids have helped me, I believe, or both me and my wife think they've helped us to grow. Would sometimes, I would, let's say, talk in a manner with the lady who's serving us food, and they would turn around and say, Baba, what kind of a tone was that? How can you speak to? And so it's coming the other way, right? And they're young, they're teenagers. And your ability to take that and say, oh, really? What did I say? What was my tone like? And to be able to stay with that. Because it's not easy, it's discomforting to have your children pick things up or pick things out, especially the things that you value. Because I believe that I was kind of aware that there is a class divide, and be sensitive about how you speak and what are the kind of language that you use with people who help you and support you. I thought I was aware, but they made me so much more. I mean, they made me question that within and ask that, really? You think that you're being sensitive? But that's what you said, and this is what the content was. And to be able to step back and, as a father, say that, oh yeah, I think I could have a look at that, right? Will you point it out the next time it happens? I'll be grateful. And to be able to have that conversation is important, is vital to be able to make the shifts and changes in the systems that we live in, right? And I think that if we are, so this is an attitudinal change, isn't it? And if we're able to change that attitude, then the other changes will come automatically.
Yeah, I mean, hands-on dads actually make better men, I think, and better women, right? Like, I think while we parent our children, we learn so much. And I think when men miss out on that, I mean, they're missing out for themselves, bringing up their children. I think it kind of helps their emotional growth. But I just wanted to, quick a few questions that I have, when the conversation around gender-based violence. But one thing which a lot of young men tell us is actually the violence amongst men, like the bullying. When we talk about, we're talking about men and women actually in the context of masculinities. The pressures that men feel to conform and the kind of bullying that happens, how that shapes them, the fact that they can't show that they're vulnerable, how does that play out in this constant anger and aggression?
So there is enough and more evidence to say that bullying can be extremely erosive and can cause very complex mental health problems, including traumatic life experiences which you carry for the rest of your life. And there are people who have got bullied in school perhaps 2 decades ago, and it begins to show up when they're 30 or 40. So the impact of bullying is profound, it's deep, it's extremely damaging. There's no question that bullying is something that seeps into systems of school and playgrounds, takes the form of ragging, which in a way is legitimizing bullying, right? You were saying that you can do this to your juniors and when they come to college, yeah? And fundamentally wrong but then it's a part of so-called culture, as they say, in colleges and institutions. There's no question that it has to do with patriarchy and the hierarchies that we imbibe before we go to school or we go to college. It becomes our right to be able to take that position and dictate things and dominate over other people, right? It becomes, your privilege and uncompromising power that you want to feel in those situations. And it can come from, and we know this, that people who bully might have been bullied themselves. So they might have had or experienced things like that at home, in school, before they turned into bullies themselves, isn't it? So again, it's in a way, bullying and also what happens in gender violence are sources of trauma. And these are traumatic patterns of behaviors that are transgenerational, that cascade down from one generation to the other. We might change the face or the expression of it, but if we are not careful with it, it can actually get into a cellular level. Yeah? Even when you talk about things which is to do with equality and amongst genders and how we talk to each other, etc., at an intellectual level, when it comes to the crunch, when you hit a roadblock or a bump, a stressful period, those deep-seated patterns of behavior in the form of aggression or intimidation in different ways comes up, right? And that's what you see in schools in the form of bullying, ragging in colleges, and the impact of that is deep. And that's why it's important to talk about it in the way you are doing at CEQUIN, by gathering influencers who can then go out and open up these conversations. So there is reflection and introspection about what is it that I'm doing with my frustration? What is it that I'm doing with my self-doubt? What is it that I'm doing when I feel threatened? How am I processing that feeling, right? And there can be conversations like that, right? Whether we do, and again, we don't have to wait for it to become a crisis. It needn't be that once domestic violence has happened, once rape has happened, it's then we'll address these people. Although that's very important as well. We can address many things even after a very tragic event has happened. But there could be many other things if we are aware, if we are proactive. We can then work with institutions, we can work with spaces out there in the community where these things will become a part of our conversation.
With all the activism around gender-based violence, the Me Too movement, young men kind of felt like villainized, right? Threatened, uncomfortable. At the end of the day, there are so many wonderful men out there, and the stereotyping of all men as potentially violent. So where did we kind of go wrong? Did we fail to communicate better with young men? What can we do better from your point of view?
So this had to happen, I believe, right? I mean, once a movement starts and the pendulum swings, it sometimes goes to the other extreme, and perhaps while in doing so, it actually, raised the issue or kind of made public behaviors, sometimes very subtle, of young men who were not even aware as to what they were doing, right? And that's why the shock and the feeling of being betrayed. How could you do this to me? Because I thought we were friends. I thought we were going out together. I mean, how can you turn around and say that I did this to you? Because those, again, these subtle boundaries of consent, of respecting the other person's physical space, of asking before you do something in a relationship, those were not a part of young people's behaviors or vocabulary even, right? So when they started coming up, many young people felt very betrayed because they thought that this was unfair. I mean, I thought we were in this together, right? How can you turn around? And this happened even with relationships that older men had when they were younger, and those women were coming out and saying, I mean, you did this to me when we were we were partners. And there was so much of outrage against that as well. Again, I think that this is the beginning of a movement where hopefully there'll be more conversations around these things, and hopefully there will be some equity. And when I say equity rather than equality, it's not just about rights and boundaries, but also take the history along with us. Remember what men have done to women over millennia, and then take the call on what you need to change now. So there is a baggage that we have to carry as humanity, as men, and it's important to acknowledge that and own it and say that, yes, of course. So maybe I'm overcompensating now. Maybe I'm bending over backwards to listen to you and to change myself. It's hard. But I'm also aware that you face this in other parts of your life, and I'm really sorry you did. And let me see if I can make a difference by at least changing our equation, our relationship, our conversations, and redefine some of these boundaries. So that comes later, isn't it? But in the beginning, the backlash was was going to come. It was inevitable. And that's not bad entirely. I think that had to happen.
That's
Yeah.
good to hear,
Yeah.
because it had to happen, and it's not easy to give up power. It's not easy to give up space, and it is going to be hard for young men who kind of took it for granted that there was the space was for them alone, and sharing that space with women. They need to, I guess, learn there's a value in sharing that space, like Mr. Shombi Sharp in the morning said, that actually it'll make the men feel more special when they are both men and women in the room. So that's, thanks for that. I have very limited time to kind of take some, because we have to have a few questions. I didn't get to kind of ask you about how your experience was with the influencers, because you are one of the people who were, you were a resource person at the workshop, and you're here 8 months down the line. So maybe like just a quick kind of thing of, what your experience has been with this campaign.
So I think it was wonderful and really enriching, and a learning experience for me as well. So I remember when we started the workshop on mental health, very quickly there was a divide in the room, right? So already there was a divide because there were some tables where the young men were more vocal and their body language was different, and they had more of a say even in the previous session, I could see. And then there were the quieter lot who seemed to be perhaps a little more reflective. And when the mental health issues started coming up, some of those quieter people started speaking up, and they started speaking up about their own challenges and sometimes their own, mental health difficulties they've gone through. And in the beginning, it drew some sniggers, and there's a swagger changed to sniggers, and then and then after that, there was an acknowledgement. Eventually, so I mean, part of that, of course, happened because there was discussion around it about mental health, and then some of the very confident young men, like I said, the tables who were very forthcoming and vocal, they also began very slowly acknowledging that, yes, some of these things that happen with us is always not pleasant, and sometimes we don't know what to do with our frustration, and sometimes we really feel upset and sad, but we have no way of expressing it. We don't know who to go to, and things like that. So those were, and of course, I think that at the end of it all, we were able to, I think, come up with some exercises and way forward as to how they might be able to take mental health as a small part of what they can do and take it to the community. So that's what we talked about. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll just maybe take 3 or 4 questions. Please go ahead and just introduce yourself and keep the question short, please.
Hi, my name is Meher. Thank you so much for the session. Very profound, very, very profound. And I work on social determinants of health and equity. Bell Hooks, many years back, decades ago, had mentioned that when a lot of women and children wish that men would just sort of evaporate, or, and that would bring some closure. But that would also bring a lot of grief, because we don't want our men to go away altogether. It would cause dual emotions. So I do feel that from Bell Hooks' time, we've come a long way, because today I don't believe that we want men to evaporate altogether. But I do believe that when
Thank you.
No. So, but when it comes to men, I'm very fascinated by men and young men's mental health in particular. My question to you is, in your experience as a mental health professional, do you feel that young men, it's a two-pronged question, are young men amenable to help seeking? And when they are amenable to help seeking, what are some of the enablers and barriers when it comes to help-seeking behaviors? Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to also respond to what that eminent gentleman said about men evaporating. It's, woman, sorry. Okay, I should have thought of that. So I think it's complex, when we talk about what to do with men who are dominant, aggressive, who are so patriarchal in their ways. What do women and children do with it? Yeah, and some of what we have done in terms of putting down laws and very firm boundaries around it has turned into, again, punitive action, isn't it? So we have defined what is unacceptable behavior from a man, and this is what the consequence will be, isn't it? Yeah, and when the consequences actually happen, then the feelings that the women and the children have is often very mixed, and that's our experience with it. So we work oftentimes with children whose fathers have actually been sent to jail under POCSO because they abuse their own children sexually, right? And yet these kids, although they feel better about the justice in it, but they also have a certain, I wouldn't say remorse, but sadness about how the family got broken and how the father went. And they still want to maintain communication. They want to see the man in jail. They go and want to visit him and stuff like that. So it's important to, again, understand, which ties in with what CEQUIN is doing right now by addressing this whole issue with men, is that if justice remains only punitive, then not much is going to change. It has to be restorative. It has to be rehabilitative. And for that to happen, the men have to participate in it. They have to have agency, onus, and be able to actually, be a part of the change. Only then will lasting change happen, isn't it? Which is why this initiative is so important. And I felt excited about it right from the word go. Whether young people are open to change or not these days, it depends on various factors, oftentimes the spaces they come from, right? So there are some spaces, school, colleges, etc., where these topics are discussed more openly, right? And there are other colleges, including the professional colleges where they teach medicine and engineering, where the hierarchies and are much more rigid, yeah? And there you find that they are very much more resistant to the idea of challenging that hierarchy. And that hierarchy happens not just between men and women, but even the professions that they, let's say for instance, the doctors will immediately believe, even in a multidisciplinary team, that they are the ones who will make the decisions, and so on. So I'm talking about other kinds of hierarchies, which have parallels with patriarchy. So again, it depends on, but overall, if you ask me, I think many more young men are willing to, to accept, to listen, and be a part of the change. Yeah, it's not easy for many, but it's a good sign that they're willing to invest in it.
Just take a couple of more because you're really running out of time. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ayushi. I'm an intern working at CEQUIN. My question was, as you mentioned, how parents or guardians often ignore the mistakes or mischief of their child by saying he's just a child or he's so naive. So my question was, what are some examples of good parenting to prevent such a situation where a child doesn't realize their mistakes and get away for the future generations, so that the child learns accountability from the beginning?
Wow, that's a big parenting question. So a lot of that depends on the developmental stage and the age of the child and the kind of relationship you share. The first and foremost thing is that if you have a good connect and a safe relationship with the child, it is much easier to have those conversations, to work on it, Day in and day out, work on the relationship with your child is important. And then as your child becomes ready to understand some of these issues about boundaries, say for instance, children, when they get frustrated at 2 or 3, they will hit out, isn't it, right? Or they might, as they grow a little older, they might begin to talk in terms like, वो तो उसके साथ नहीं खेलूँगा मैं, वो तो लड़की है, वो तो उसको कुछ नहीं पता. Now immediately you could pick on that and say, what makes you think that? What makes you think that? So what makes you think that girls can't do anything, right? Oh, वो तो गुड़ियाओं के साथ खेलती है. अच्छा, so have you actually seen her doing her classwork? Have you seen her copy? Have a look at yours and have a look at hers, right? So there are many ways of actually bringing that into the conversation without threatening, without being again, punitive or very judgmental towards the boy. So again, these are conversations that one can begin to have, and that happens only if you have a good connect and a good relationship with your child, and that's vital. And then it's a journey that you make, because your child will grow, they will encounter the world around them, they will come back with confusion and questions that you said this, but that doesn't happen outside. The boys, the way they talk about women, you keep talking about respecting women, but that's not what happens outside. How do you deal with that? And if you have made the space at home safe to have those conversations, your child will bring it back to you. Yeah? But if you are already, squirming, and your child can notice that you're anxious about a question like that, they will probably not bring it to you the next time. So you have to ask some of these value-based questions to yourself. What do you stand for? And sort it out in your own head so that you can respond to your child as well. Yeah? Yeah.
Hi, very good morning, sir. I am Tia from, I can ask the question, right?
Just this one and one more, that's it.
Okay. Hi, I am Tia from Parivartan, the Gender Forum of Kirodimal College. I had a very quick example for you. For example, there's a man, a husband, a father who is having a really stressful time at his job. He comes back home and he takes that stress out on his wife and on his kids. He lashes out, he's very angry, and he's simply yelling at them and abusing them. In that scenario, even if the wife goes to the man or the kids go to their father and they ask, Papa, aap itna gussa kyun kar rahe ho? Aapko itna gussa kyun aa raha hai? The man believes कि मुझे गुस्सा आपकी वजह से आ रहा है because आपने ऐसी हरकत करी. मैं जॉब में बहुत responsible हूँ, जॉब में संभाल सकता हूँ, गुस्सा आपकी वजह से आ रहा है. How do we deal with men who are not even willing to acknowledge their own emotions? And it's not that he's lying to his kids, he genuinely believes that the job is not stressful and he's not feeling any complicated emotions, when in reality he is.
So clearly this man needs to grow up, right? Yeah. So, there are no easy answers. I think each family should be able to take it up in a way. So this is a very scary and threatening situation for the mother and the children already, isn't it? And it's very hard to expect them to stand up to it and say, no, we are not going to take this and we will change the world. It's very hard to do. But they can look for resources, right? Like they can look for resources within the family. They can also, perhaps if it really is going bad and the children are getting affected, sometimes they can access organizations like yours or NGOs where they reach out. So there are things in the community which are more accessible now than before. And hopefully the mother at some point in time may feel empowered through family, through other resources, to be able to take it up from time to time with the husband and say that this is not acceptable. Sometimes men listen to boundaries in a way that you don't expect, especially if you're firm and convinced about what you're saying, and I've seen that happen in many households, including my own, where it is said, and it is, for instance, been told to me, sorry, not going to work, not accepting, right, yeah? And sometimes that works. Sometimes they taken aback and saying, okay, what do I do then? What do I do now if it is not? So of course, then there are extreme consequences. The woman might decide that if it happens again, I'm going to take my children, go to my parents' place for 2 days and then return, right? And if you're okay about it, or I'll take it up with somebody who's responsible and sensitive in your family, and maybe that will work, right? So sometimes you have to take, kind of twist it around, a little to be able to get your results.
Just one last from Poonam, that's it. Yeah.
एक क्वेश्चन बस.
Yes.
Please, यहाँ पे already है. You can meet him during lunch, please. I'm really running out of time. Sorry for that.
Dr. Sen,
Yes.
Given the narrative today of an aspirational India and aspirational women, aspirational young girls especially, there's enough research and action to show that women are more aspirational, are very aspirational about their education, having fewer children, having children late, working, etc. What do we know about the boys and their aspirations? And in a situation where, because you both, the data and the fact that you work with men and boys, parents as well as the kids, what kind of aspirational narrative can we bring in where young men aspire to change the masculine behavior, which is
Sure, sure. That's a very complex question, Poonam, but I'll try and respond to it in brief. So, yes, women, young women, girls are much more aspirational, and they're, in that sense, if you look at it as a competitive world, they're eating into the boys and the men's spaces. And that can be threatening, challenging, and cause a lot of doubts even as to where they belong. For instance, in academics, even in entrance exams for professional colleges, many times the girls do much better, isn't it? Yeah? And that threatens the boys because the scope of making it in life, so to say, being successful, that diminishes because there's another large group coming and taking this space over, isn't it? Yeah? And that's what sometimes causes the violence. Sometimes, like Rahul Bose was talking about, that the violence becomes much more severe because these women are not listening anymore. They are aspiring to come and take our space. And that is indeed very threatening for many young men. And over there, the concept of success, which also emerges from patriarchy, from toxic masculinity or masculinity even, that's success, competition, making it big at the expense of somebody else, then needs to be questioned, even amongst the men, isn't it? So rather than the competition, if we can then begin to talk about in terms of, so one is that, what are they aspiring? Yeah, I mean, young men still continue to aspire. Whether they get there or not is another question because of how the world has changed, right? But what can we do to help them aspire in a different way is another question. And that is where the conversations like this will help. Because then they might say that, we'll do it together. I think it's a win-win. If men and women, let's say, look at parenting or childcare or education, of course, they always have been, even in mental health, actually, especially with when we work with children, there's a huge, what should I say, predominance of women who work there. For instance, in our organization, we have, I think, about close to 70 therapists and doctors. I think not more than 10 would be men. The rest of them are women. And that actually brings the kind of things you require in an organization like ours, where you need compassion, you need cooperation, you need collaboration when you plan things, and you need the sensitivity to understand neurodiversity. All those things, perhaps women bring more spontaneously. And if men can see that, then again they can come together, and that's what they can aspire for, I think, where we can co-create spaces of work, of career, of the human condition.
Thank you so much. We
Thank
just
you.
have to wrap this up. Please do make the most of Dr. Sen being here, and please meet him during lunch.